G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and a fantastic end to your weekend. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over, but this video, more so than most, is actually going to build on certain elements. So there will be parts later in the video that won't make sense unless you've watched parts earlier, and a lot of that is going to be about Trump's secondary sanctions. What does this actually look like? How would those actually be then implemented, and what is the global response to this? What then the main country he would be talking about is China. And does this then turbocharge de-dollarization? So we'll talk about all of that, the impacts and the consequences on the Russian economy if those were to come into play. Of course, we'll be looking at the maps. We'll talk about what Trump has put on his truth.com thing after a meeting with Zelensky. And he says basically exactly what we've been saying, that Putin can just string along Trump on this. He can entertain the idea of Trump's peace deal, knowing Zelensky's never going to, and make it look like that he's not the one holding it up, that it is then Zelensky. But what I'll say is, in that I'm going to go, the idea of peace is so far apart, I think it's highly unlikely we find it. So we'll do that. But where we'll start is actually with Kursk. And today what we do have is we do have confirmation of North Korean soldiers that fought in Russia's Kursk Oblast, as well as then Russia claiming that Kursk has now come back under their full control. Now, as far as full control, let's jump onto the map here. And of course, we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Now, we're not going to explain these areas yet. It doesn't matter. We're going to be looking at them a bit later on for this. What we'll be looking at is up in here in Kursk, between Sumy and Kursk, both Ukraine and Russia. And what we see on this map, the Ukrainian deep state, is if we step back to yesterday and then come to today, we have two updates, but irregardless, we do see definite Russian advance on this sector. And Deep State, they have said in this that, yes, there has definitely been advancements, but the claim that the Russians have taken back all of this area isn't true. But the situation is not in the best shape. The enemy does not give up attempts to advance and gain a foothold into Sumy, and that they are accumulating in the village of Zorivka. So we have spoken about these areas as well. So Zoravka, Basivkia, Vasilivkia, where this grey zone has come across. So then let's look on then the Suryak map, get an idea in this sector. And this is down the Guevo area, but near Gornal is the small area down here we are looking at. And here's showing that there has been advances in here, but there's still an area controlled by Ukraine by the Suryak maps. We do also have a geolocation in Gornal, which is sitting just here, but in that grey zone right on the border of that blue. And what we see then by this footage is a Russian flag being flown. So definite confirmation of soldiers in this vicinity. And realistically, where do I think the border is sitting? I do believe there are some thin strips in here that are controlled at this point in time by the Ukrainian armed forces. But realistically, I think this is very, very minimal. Even by the Deep State map, we're talking 5 square kilometres here, and I think 12, 13 here. So we're talking under 20. Realistically, I think it's more around probably 10. But I don't think it's been fully captured, but I think that is imminent to see that fully pushed back. Will we see it cross? So let's look then at Dmitry Peskov, of course, a Kremlin spokesman, has then said, and this is being reported by TASS, of course, a Russian news network, that the operation to liberate Kursk from Ukrainian troops, they said, has been completed. Now, Dmitry Peskov says the chief of the general staff of the armed forces, Valery Gerasimov, has reported to Supreme Commander-in-Chief Vladimir Putin that the operation to liberate the Kursk region from the Ukrainian neo-Nazis has been completed. So they're saying fully to the border. Chief of Russia's general staff, Gerasimov, reported to Putin that Russian troops had liberated the last settlement. So yes, the last settlement probably is, as far as if we're nitpicking ground, there's probably still presence there. Now, Gerasimov said today the last settlement on the territory of the Kursk region, the village of Gornal, has been liberated from Ukrainian troops. And then furthermore on this, talking about then crossing the border into Sumy. But this is an important bit here. Gerasimov also commended the role of North Korean fighters in the liberation of the Kursk region. I want to specifically note the participation of servicemen from the DPRK in liberating border areas of the Kursk region, who, in accordance with the Treaty on the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership between our countries, rendered considerable assistance in crushing the Ukrainian army's combat group that launched an incursion. Now, remember, the North Korean soldiers, this was drips and drabs of evidence and then blown overboard massively in the beginning. That there were slight bits of evidence that, it was blurry at best, and then it was a bit of the boy who cried wolf. As better evidence even came forward, it became, you lied about this and that, and that's not very clear. But we do know from confirmation here that North Koreans were then fighting there. And that is what we said, is we said, look, I believe that the North Koreans were fighting there, but I said a lot of this evidence is questionable at best. The sources that I had were saying about North Korean artillery crews, as well as some frontline soldiers embedded in with the Russians to gain experience. And I still believe that's most likely where it was. And now it's confirmed that there definitely was soldiers there. As Russia's military chief pointed out, soldiers and officers from the Korean People's Army were accomplishing combat objectives shoulder to shoulder with the Russian servicemen in the process of repelling Ukrainian incursion that showed high professionalism, displayed endurance, courage, and heroism in combat. Russian troops are in control of over 90 square kilometres in the territory of Sumy. He says, in compliance with your instructions, efforts to continue to create a security zone in the border areas of Sumy region of Ukraine. So wanting to create a further buffer zone there. And by just the deep state map, this area is around about 50 square kilometres, 3. So let's go around 55 square kilometres that this is showing. Syriac shows a lot more in here. It's actually under control. This, of course, is just grey zone, but we do know there's definitely been some level of pushback there, and I won't be surprised to see that push over the border. But Kursk, it's looking like Kursk realistically is over, and at one point it looked like this. It was very, very large, and as we look back at the Kursk operation, I am glad that we stuck to our guns and we based our analysis of doctrine and history, not feelings and optics, regardless of how much criticism we got, stating basically that I don't understand what Ukraine is actually trying to do here because it doesn't mesh with our knowledge of attritional warfare doctrine if you are the smaller side without the initiative to open up a new and very costly front line. Because by opening that up in then your enemy's territory, you are instantly surrounded on 3 sides. And after that initial shock of moving in, and once they sort of find their feet, you then won't have the logistical advantage. So that was what we stepped into this with. I'm glad we stuck to our guns there. Now, Russia and Ukraine, they both boast huge numbers of losses here. You'll see 60, 70,000 being quoted around the pages. Now, it's highly likely that both of these are inflated. But we do know that this was very, very costly. But we need to also take into account, at least initially, the losses that Russia was taking were conscripts, lower-end soldiers. And that Ukraine's in the beginning, these were their best soldiers and best equipment doing offensive operations into this area. That's why we saw what it looked like for the first few weeks. And there were a lot of guys who were then lost or tied up as a operation of distraction and optics. And what this did was this allowed Russia to gain ground even faster in eastern Ukraine. As I've shown you by then our charts showing monthly movements, Kursk happened, and then we just by chance, correlation causation I guess, saw everything in the east move far faster. Another thing that we saw enter the battlefield was the full implementation of fiber optically controlled drones, now which I believe, at least from the footage I see, make up the majority of kills on the battlefield for drones. Now, I'm not saying that fiber optics outnumber radio-controlled drones, but I'm saying the amount of footage of kills on vehicles that I see is more from the fiber optics. So I guess their kill rate, from what I'm seeing, is much higher. But let's talk about Kursk and that optics we spoke of. Now, to quote Tatarigami UA, he says, propaganda is a double-edged sword. And another thing we've said before about propaganda is you always pay the tax. In attritional warfare, propaganda needs to support military operations, not military operations supporting propaganda, aka the other way around. And overall, in my opinion, Kursk has been a net negative. There was some positives, but I believe overall it was a negative. There was large losses of men on both sides, of course, large losses, but Ukraine can't afford to lose as much as Russia. At very, very best, I believe this is probably 1-to-1, if not actually worse in the favour of Ukraine. When you look at artillery, FABs, offensive operations, and then being on three sides here, if you apply the same logic that people apply into eastern Ukraine, it goes that way, if that makes sense. Massive loss of machine. We saw some of the best machines from the Abrams, the Leopards, and everything used up in here. Of course, sacrificed a lot of ground in the east and further demoralisation of forces in this sector. And of course, those guys that had then their troops moved off the east and they were then thinned out, it did have a psychological impact there. There's no one, I don't think, who can actually deny that that occurred. But what was positive here? Well, it did provide Ukraine a very important informational win when there was nothing but negative news coming from the front for month on month on month. Remember, this is very important because Ukraine's centre of gravity is not in Kyiv, it's in the west, and Ukraine, they need to keep up the optics of victory to keep the supply then running for those who are supplying the capability in, which is the west. Sadly, they need to do this even if it is at the expense of sound military tactics and doctrine. Now, and some notable victories in this as well was the change of policy regarding long-range strikes from Western weapons into Russia and working more closely with the Republic of South Korea, aka Republic of Korea, aka South Korea, due to the presence of North Korean soldiers. And what really was trying to get pushed here was the ROK's constitution and policy change around export of weapons to a country that is currently in war. Now, that didn't come through, but it looked very, very close for Ukraine at one point. And as we know, European defence companies aren't keeping up with their own needs. This is why Poland and Denmark and other nations are buying South Korean weapon systems at this point. But in the end, I do believe that this had a net negative effect, and irreplaceable and irrecoverable losses of the best equipment and the most highly trained forces just was at the sacrifice of the sheer quantity then of equipment and kilometre squares we saw lost then in the east. And we see that psychological impact of soldiers complaining as to why the Kursk operation was happening, and that why became even more at the forefront when we then saw Kursk seemingly fall apart overnight from Russia's famous tunnel mission. So there was positives, there was negatives, but I think overall it had more of an effect, negative effect on Ukraine than that short-lived positive. And that's where I say you always pay the tax, and propaganda is a double-edged sword. So of course the Pope's funeral has been taking place at the Vatican, and Zelensky and Trump had an impromptu meeting. So let's look over this. And this is some of the famous photographs that are coming out of this. Zelensky said, "Good meeting. We discussed a lot one-on-one, hoping for results on everything we covered, protecting the lives of our people, full and unconditional ceasefire, reliable and lasting peace that will prevent another form of war breaking out. Very symbolic meeting that has potential to become historic if we achieve joint results with President Trump here." And then Trump has then gone on his Twitter and said this: "No matter what deal I make with respect to Russia, Ukraine, no matter how good it is, even if it's the greatest deal ever made, the failing New York Times will speak badly of it." New York Times wrote that Ukraine should get back territory, including, I suppose, Crimea and other ridiculous requests, in order to stop the killing that is worse than anything since World War II. And this is one thing we have seen Trump then speak about, is that Crimea will likely become de jure control by Russia, and him pointing out and others pointing out what is the realistic goal to recover Crimea here. And as Trump says, that it was given away without a shot fired back in the day. Now, again, what we see here is he says, "I have nothing to do with this war," criticising both Obama and Joe Biden. Now, just a point I want to make on this is don't act like, just because you hate Trump, let's not act like Trump inherited also a winning war. But by shifting this blame too, it does mean, regardless of how this ends, you can go, well, that was because of what you set me up for. And with all that being said, there was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas, cities, and towns over the last few days. And it makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me along. and has to be dealt with differently through banking or secondary sanctions. Too many people are dying. Now, what I'll say in this is, no shit. We've been talking about this, that all Putin needs to do is entertain these ideas that are absolutely inconceivable to Zelensky to sign. Therefore, it's making it look like it is Zelensky not the one wanting peace. Now, what I'm saying is it's not like the other side, being Zelensky and Europe, is presenting a realistic peace deal. To be honest, given the situation at the front line, the European-Ukraine peace deal is far more ridiculous than the American one that was presented. As far as all this territory needs to go back, walk out, all this, that's just not going to occur. But what I'm saying in this too, I don't believe either can occur. We'll talk about these banking and secondary sanctions in a second, but talking on that just neither of these really have legs is a couple of quotes here. When the distance between demands is greater than the will to compromise, war becomes a contest of endurance, ending only when one side breaks under the weight of its own losses. Also, when demands are irreconcilable and compromise is seen as defeat, war becomes a matter of endurance. It ends only when one side can no longer stand. And this is where I believe this war is heading, that neither side see that compromise is a viable option, and it will lead to full defeat or into terms that are much, much worse for one side in the near future. So Trump, of course, he has spoken about secondary sanctions before, and he's mentioned them again. So how would this actually look? And secondary sanctions, they actually do raise some concerns. On the surface, everything looks and sounds great, but it is not that simple in a world global economy when US hegemony is less than it was a few decades ago. Now, simply, secondary sanctions, they would punish foreign companies or individuals who do business with Russia, even if they have no direct ties to the US. They'll also punish state agencies if they're dealing heavily with Russia. Now, Trump, he would threaten or actually cut off, you have to go through with it, any foreign company, country or individual that is still doing major business with Russia from access to the US market and banking systems, essentially forcing these countries to choose sides. Keep that choosing sides in the forefront of your mind for a minute. Now, the main targets of this is in order: China, India, Turkey, the UAE, Kazakhstan, and Brazil. Now, an important one in this is to look at what countries are in BRICS. The top two are, and both of them have a lot going on at the moment, both internationally and domestically. And two others in this, as far as the United Arab Emirates and Kazakhstan, then looking to join BRICS as far as the UAE, or Kazakhstan has very close ties with both Russia and China. Brazil, massive growing country at the moment, of course, is in BRICS also. So how does this actually look? What are the consequences here? Now, for Russia, it would become much harder for them to import high-tech goods, to export their oil, and to manage their foreign reserves. For the world economy, what we would see, though, is higher oil prices, supply and demand, increased tensions with China and India, and trade disputes with Europe. Of course, there's still a lot of countries buying Russian energy, and that oil price, supply-demand, that oil price still will increase. And by doing that, it may buffer some of the loss of then volume. Now, for the US, there is a risk of overreach. Many countries do accuse the US of massive economic overreach. And this may force countries to accelerate de-dollarization to escape US leverage. And this is a major concern. And BRICS is wanting to accelerate the movement away from the dollar. And by forcing states to, quote, choose sides, it may result in USD dominance in global trade eroding more quickly. And the consequence geopolitically is a widening of fractures between the West and, say, neutral countries, Saudi, UAE, India, China. That will become much more wide. Again, forcing a choose of sides. Now, secondary sanctions would definitely hit Russia a lot harder. It will definitely have a large impact on Russia's ability to do trade and then to finance the war. But at the same time, these secondary sanctions would likely speed up the world's efforts to move away from US financial dominance. Comes at a pretty bad time after Trump's blanket sanctions. You'd see more countries trying to ditch the dollar. Alliances with Europe and neutral countries would definitely be strained. Global markets could take a hit from all the disruption. And ironically, China would probably come out stronger as countries look for alternative economic partners. And if you're looking for alternative economic partner and you've been secondary sanctioned and you're forced to choose sides, you're going to be looking towards the second largest by USD or largest by purchasing power parity economy in the world of China. So let's talk about China for a second. Now, China ultimately, they want a world order that's dominated less by the US. That's their ultimate goal. That is the all under heaven. This is why China, they are not in an alliance partnership with Russia. It is strategic only. China, like the US and like a lot of countries have found out recently, they do not have permanent friends or enemies. They have strategic interest. And Russia, they are a useful partner to China to weaken US influence. But do not think that China see Russia as an equal. As it has been said, Russia is a useful partner, but the United States is the real obstacle to China's rise. China will support Russia when it's convenient, but it won't sacrifice its own future just to save Moscow. But what I say in this is don't think for a second that if China see opportunity to reduce the US, their global dominance, the USD, that they won't take it. And Trump's sanctions, they would fuel China's argument for a new global financial system due to what they say is massive economic overreach and weaponizing global sanctions and tariffs. So the thing is with this is it will definitely impact Russia. But what is the fallout on that? And does that accelerate countries like BRICS? Because the main nations you're looking at in this are BRICS nations. Does that accelerate that movement away from the dollar and what they want to do as far as de-dollarization? Again, I think Trump in this, with those sanctions, is playing with fire because you're also then impeding on countries' independence and sovereignty as well. So we will see, but that alarm bells should be somewhat going off in that. So let's have a look at the maps. Here, of course, is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, no red check on this map today. We haven't actually had a map update, but the first area will come is actually into then Sumy and Russia's Belgorod Oblast. Now, this should be blue. We've seen troops operating here. We believe they've been here for some time, but it does look like Russia has pushed back some elements back in here by Syriac maps. Again, this doesn't meet the threshold for us to confirm this, but situation in Belgorod, in the last days, Russian army managed to recapture the locality of Popovka, that sits right here, and expelled Ukrainian army towards the forest area at the border, so pushing back in here. And this won't surprise me. So I believe, and I've always believed this small movement into Belgorod was never to capture a amount of ground here. What it was trying to do was buffer Russia's advancements in Kursk to actually be able to withdraw soldiers out of here. It was a distraction element. And now that this is realistically gone, this element will likely then withdraw out and allow to be pushed out. That's how I at least see this. But there is concern that now there's a lot that's mobilized in here of a crossing into Sumy. As well with this, now that Russia, or at least they say that they have got back to the border here, they may be more open to negotiations because they see, well, none of our ground is occupied now, and that's a card off the table for Ukraine. Maybe they'll be more willing for some level of negotiation. Now, let's continue moving down this in no real order. We'll firstly come down into the Kyiv front, and what we're looking for is Mala Tokmachka. Now, in this direction in here, we do know there's a lot more Russian presence and operations. Not too many movements on the deep state map, but we can see by Surik saying situation zap front. During the last 3 days, Ukrainian army expelled the Russian army from the part of Mala Tokmachka taken a week ago. And what we need to line up is really where then Bilohirya is, where Mala Tokmachka is, and this movement just in this sector right where my cursor is at the moment. We're looking for, see this paddock here, this paddock in here. Looks like the side profile of a boob in there. That's what we're looking for. So apparently a pushback out of there, but that is well beyond even the grey zone shown on this map. Then we'll continue our way up. We'll pass Velika Novosilkia front. Then we'll come to then Pokrovsk, and we'll bring up the Syriac map. And we can see just some small movements out of, I call this the Zaporizhzhia front that has happened in here. We know there has been definitely some movement in here, but as far, nothing is groundbreaking in here. Movement where my cursor is, movement where my cursor is at the moment. Nothing that's too major in here. But what this is all part of is it is widening that western flank of Pokrovsk as the far northwestern part of this around Kotleny, Udashny has ground to a halt, but we now see more movement in that direction. Now we'll come to what I call eastern Pokrovsk, which is where this envelopment is occurring around here. The Sukabalka front is mainly what people will refer to it as. And we can see a few changes on this. So more movement up to Staria Mykolaievka. We can see where the grey zone is sitting here. Surak is showing that as red, so advancement into there. What I will say by that is that does indicate there was definitely a level of movement by grey and red if we overlay these two maps. And then we'll come just to the west of here and we have then Tarasivkia front line. Now, again, this can be hard to match up, so it's showing right in this, as well as Syriac shows that Tarasivkia, a lot of that came under control. So let's read through this. That the situation at Tarasivkia was clarified. The northern house of locality remain under control of the Ukrainian army, while clashes with the Russian troops are taking place at northern warehouses. So movement in here and just slightly to the east. And the last area we will look is then Toretsk. So this is what we are looking for today. And what we see is no movement in Toretsk, but to the northeast of Toretsk, very large movement. So see this grey zone in here, this then waterway here, this is right up in this sector all the way through where this large amount of grey area is. And let me see if that grey has moved over the past few days at all. Can I step back? No, it hasn't. But Syriac is showing this as red. During the last 2 weeks, Russian forces have made an important advance west of the water channel between Druzhba and this area here. So this is Druzhba and where the water channels then run, taking control of several trenches in the area along the Balmutka River. During the last week, the Russian forces managed to increase their control along the road between Dashny and Druzhba, from where the Ukrainian army managed to infiltrate into the second locality. So this infiltration in down between these two, but a lot of this he's claiming is coming under red control. And he talks about later on that what Russia is trying to do is, after basically capturing Toretsk and then counter attacks in here by Ukraine taking back some significant areas in Toretsk, that Russia is now focusing on the northern flank of here and trying to do a bypass, because the fighting in itself is just a meat grinder in the center of Toretsk at the moment. So again, a lot happening. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.